These foods unclog arteries and can prevent a heart attack. These are 17 foods that have been measured in randomized trials and in cohorts running as long as 30 years, changing what happens inside human arteries. This is the reason cardiologists stopped describing arteries as pipes and started describing them as living tissue that answers to what you put in your mouth. The popular picture gets it wrong from the first frame. Most people imagine a pipe slowly filling with grease until one day nothing gets through, and that is almost never how a heart attack begins. Roughly 70% of them start when an unstable plaque, what cardiologists call a vulnerable plaque, tears open and spills its contents into the bloodstream, where a clot forms in seconds. Here is the finding that reshaped the field. In nearly two-thirds of patients arriving at hospital with an acute coronary event, an angiogram taken weeks or months earlier had shown that same spot narrowed by less than 70%, and often less than 50%. The plaque that kills you is frequently not the biggest one in the artery. It carries a large soft lipid core under a thin fibrous cap, and it fails the way a blister fails. That distinction decides everything about how food fits in, because diet does not work like a plumber's snake. It works on the wall of the artery itself. Every stage of this disease traces back to one lining. The endothelium, a single layer of cells coating the inside of every vessel, manufactures nitric oxide, which the cardiology literature calls the most potent vasodilator the body produces on its own. Nitric oxide widens vessels, blocks the oxidation of LDL cholesterol, stops platelets clumping, keeps white blood cells from burrowing into the vessel wall, and holds smooth muscle cells in check. When nitric oxide production falters, all 5 protections falter together, and that failure is the earliest event in the whole process. Oxidized LDL fills the vacuum, and researchers name it the major causal agent in cholesterol-driven atherosclerosis. LDL gets oxidized, crosses into the artery wall, and turns into an inflammatory signal that tells the lining to display adhesion molecules and haul immune cells inside. Oxidized LDL then wrecks the enzyme that manufactures nitric oxide, a process called enos uncoupling, which throws off superoxide and drives still more oxidation. It is a loop that feeds itself, and every food on this list breaks into it somewhere. This starts far earlier than most people assume. Autopsies on young Korean War casualties turned up coronary artery involvement in 77.3% of the hearts examined, and Vietnam War data found atherosclerosis in 45% of casualties, with severe disease in 5%. Autopsy work on American children killed in road accidents showed that more than half of those aged 10 to 14 already carried early atherosclerosis, visible as lipid-laden cells lining the aorta and coronary arteries. One piece of good news hides in that grim record, because among service members autopsied between 2001 and 2011, early atherosclerosis had fallen dramatically compared with the war era. So the damage accumulates quietly for decades, and the real question is whether food pushes it backwards. 4 trials answered that. The lifestyle heart trial came first, published in The Lancet in 1990 by Dean Ornish, who randomized 28 patients to a low-fat vegetarian diet with smoking cessation, stress management, and moderate exercise, against 20 on usual care. Quantitative angiography tracked 195 coronary lesions. After 12 months, average narrowing in the intervention group had regressed from 40% to 37.8%, while controls climbed from 42.7% to 46.1%. In lesions already blocked more than half the vessel, the gap widened further. 82% of intervention patients shifted toward regression, and Medicare now recognizes the program built from that trial as intensive cardiac rehabilitation. Caldwell-Esselstyn ran the second, following 198 patient volunteers with established cardiovascular disease, 119 already through stents or bypass surgery. They cut out dairy, fish, and meat, avoided added oil, and kept their usual cardiac care alongside it. 177 stuck with it, and among that adherent 89%, the recurrent event rate landed at 0.6%, with recurrent disease amounting to a single stroke. That number needs an equally clear caveat, because this was a case series of highly motivated volunteers rather than a randomized controlled trial. Prediamide remains the largest randomized trial of a dietary pattern for cardiovascular prevention ever run. 7,447 high-risk Spanish adults were assigned to a Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil, the same diet with 30 grams a day of mixed nuts, or a control group advised to cut fat. Across a median of 4.8 years, both Mediterranean arms cut the combined rate of heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death by roughly 30%, with the olive oil arm reaching 31%. The trial carries a history worth stating plainly. Since the original 2013 paper was retracted and replaced in 2018 after randomization problems surfaced, and the reanalysis upheld both the direction and the rough size of the benefit. Cardiovascular set the hardest test because every participant already had coronary heart disease. At the Reina Sofia University Hospital in Córdoba, 502 patients went onto a Mediterranean diet and 500 onto a low-fat diet, then were followed for 7 years. The Mediterranean group received a liter of extra virgin olive oil each week with instructions to use a tablespoon a day, while the low-fat group got packs rich in complex carbohydrates and a 2-tablespoon cap on vegetable oil. Major cardiovascular events landed at 28.1 per thousand person years on the Mediterranean diet, against 37.7 on the low-fat one. Now the foods, grouped by what they act on. Nitrate-rich vegetables come first, and they turn the nitric oxide story into groceries. The Danish Diet, Cancer and Health Study tracked 53,000 people in their 50s for a median of 21 years and logged 14,000 cardiovascular cases. Those eating the most nitrate-rich vegetables ran about 2.5 millimeters of mercury lower in systolic pressure, and their heart disease risk sat 12 to 26% lower depending on the outcome. Ischemic stroke dropped 17%, heart failure 15%, ischemic heart disease 12%, and peripheral artery disease 26%, the largest reduction in the study. What produced that was not a heroic dose. 1 cup of raw or half a cup of cooked nitrate-rich vegetables a day did it, meaning spinach, rocket, lettuce, kale, and chard. A separate cohort of older women published in Stroke found that every 29 mg daily increment of vegetable nitrate tracked with 17% lower risk of an ischemic cerebrovascular event, while nitrate from non-vegetable sources predicted nothing whatsoever. Beetroot concentrates the same compound. Pooled trials put beetroot juice at 5.31 millimeters of mercury below placebo for systolic pressure. The effect fades inside a day, which makes this a habit rather than a cure, and a 13-week study found medium and low doses beating a high dose on both blood pressure and endothelial function. The second group works on cholesterol instead of the vessel wall, and viscous soluble fiber does the lifting. Oats and barley carry beta-glucan, a fiber that thickens in the gut and interferes with cholesterol absorption and bile acid recycling. The FDA authorized a health claim on it back in 1997, setting the bar at 3 grams a day, and at that dose the agency's data showed LDL falling 3 to 5%. Meta-analyses by 2011 found bigger effects, with total cholesterol down about 5% and LDL down about 7% in people with normal and elevated readings alike. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas reached the same place by a different route. A meta-analysis in the Canadian Medical Association journal pooled 26 randomized trials covering 1,037 people and found 1 daily serving of pulses delivered a modest but statistically significant 5% cut in LDL. A serving means about 3/4 of a cup, cooked. Bean type made no meaningful difference, and men saw larger reductions than women, most likely because they started from worse habits. Push viscous fiber hard enough and it starts competing with pharmaceuticals. David Jenkins at the University of Toronto assembled the portfolio diet in the early 2000s around roughly 20 grams of viscous fiber a day, drawn from oats, barley, and psyllium, plus apples, oranges, berries, persimmons, aubergine, and okra. In a 2003 study in JAMA, that pattern lowered LDL cholesterol by 28.6% inside a month, against 30.9% for the statin comparison arm. The long-term picture is more sobering and a lot more honest because a year of real-world eating produced about 13%. Whole grains extend the same logic across a whole diet, and a BMJ meta-analysis of 45 studies found every 90 grams a day, roughly 3 servings, pulling relative risk to 0.81 for coronary heart disease and 0.78 for cardiovascular disease overall. Fats make up the third group, and the evidence there is far more specific than the marketing. In May 2018, the American Heart Association reaffirmed 2 3.5-ounce servings of non-fried fish a week, favoring oily fish such as salmon, mackerel, herring, sardines, or albacore tuna, tied to lower risk of heart failure, coronary heart disease, cardiac arrest, and ischemic stroke. Capsules tell a different story. Reduce. It gave 4 grams a day of purified EPA to patients already on statins with high triglycerides, and cut the primary cardiovascular endpoint by 25%. Vital gave 1 gram a day of fish oil to people with no history of heart disease and moved nothing. Strength, combining EPA and DHA, found no benefit either, and researchers blame real biological differences between the two molecules. Flaxseed supplies the plant version, packing alpha-linolenic acid alongside lignans, phenolic compounds, and fiber. Observational meta-analyses tie higher dietary ALA to 10% lower total cardiovascular risk and 20% lower risk of fatal coronary heart disease. Trials show favorable blood pressure effects in hypertensive patients at 3 grams a day or more, sustained for at least 12 weeks. The literature splits here, since one meta-analysis found ALA lowering systolic pressure while nudging LDL cholesterol upward, so flaxseed earns its place for blood pressure more reliably than for cholesterol. Nuts post some of the strongest numbers in all of nutrition science. Pretty Meat's nut arm, at 30 grams a day of almonds, walnuts, and hazelnuts, showed a 28% lower risk of major cardiovascular events across 5 years. A 2023 Umbrella Review pooling intervention and cohort data found 28 grams a day tracking with a 21% relative risk reduction for cardiovascular disease and 25% for coronary heart disease, and the nut type barely mattered. What nuts deliver is unsaturated fat, several kinds of fiber, plant sterols, potassium, magnesium, beta-carotene, and vitamin E. Extra virgin olive oil carries the largest observational data set on this list. Marta Gouache-Ferré and colleagues at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health analyzed records from 1990 to 2018 covering 60,000 women in the Nurses' Health Study and 31,000 men in the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, publishing in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in January 2022. 19% lower cardiovascular mortality showed up in people consuming more than 7 grams a day, a little over half a tablespoon. The substitution finding is the one you can act on tonight, because swapping roughly 10 grams a day of margarine, butter, mayonnaise, or dairy fat for the same amount of olive oil tracked with lower mortality risk. Avocado got tested across 3 decades. Published in the Journal of the American Heart Association on the 30th of March 2022, the analysis followed 68,000 women and 41,000 men from 1986 to 2006, all free of heart disease and stroke at the start, recording more than 9,000 coronary events. 2 or more servings a week tracked with 16% lower cardiovascular disease risk and 21% lower coronary heart disease risk. Once lifestyle and other dietary factors were accounted for, polyphenols form the 4th group, and they work on oxidation and on the lining itself. Berries lead. Inside the Nurses' Health Study 2, 93,600 women answered dietary questionnaires every 4 years for 18 years, over which 405 heart attacks occurred. A 32% reduction in heart attack risk showed up in the women eating the most blueberries and strawberries 3 or more servings a week compared with those eating berries once a month or less. Circulation published it in January 2013 from researchers at Harvard and the University of East Anglia. What makes it persuasive is the specificity, since other flavonoid subclasses showed no significant link, pointing straight at anthocyanins which appear to dilate arteries and counter plaque buildup. Cocoa flavanols went through COSMOS, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in March 2022. More than 21,000 participants took a daily capsule holding 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols or a placebo, followed for a median of 3.6 years. The primary outcome, total cardiovascular events, did not fall significantly, and that belongs at the front of any honest summary. The pre-specified secondary endpoint showed a 27% lower rate of cardiovascular death, and among participants who actually stuck to the protocol, the numbers reached a 39% reduction in cardiovascular death. This tested a flavanol extract, not a chocolate bar. Green tea owns the longest population record. The Osaki study opened in 1994 and followed 40,000 Japanese adults aged 40 to 79 for up to 11 years. Green tea drinking tracked with reduced all-cause and cardiovascular mortality, though not with cancer mortality, and the association ran stronger in women. 14 randomized trials pooled together show green tea lowering fasting total and LDL cholesterol. Catechins get the credit since they switch on antioxidant enzymes, shut down pro-oxidant ones, and scavenge free radicals directly. Tomatoes deliver lycopene, and the cooking method changes the result. A meta-analysis of 21 qualifying trials found tomato supplementation cutting LDL cholesterol by 0.22 millimoles per liter and improving endothelial function by 2.53%, while lycopene supplementation dropped systolic pressure by 5.66 millimeters of mercury. Epidemiological pooling ties high lycopene intake to 26% lower stroke risk and 14% lower cardiovascular disease risk. Garlic has been under study for decades. 39 trials pooled together showed garlic lowering total cholesterol by 17 milligrams per deciliter and LDL by 9 in people with mildly elevated readings who kept it up beyond 2 months. A dose-response review of 19 aged garlic trials found systolic pressure down 2.49 millimeters of mercury, with diastolic pressure dropping nearly 6 millimeters at 6 weeks in men who started high. Pomegranate is the smallest study here and the one to treat most carefully. Michael Aviram and colleagues published work in Clinical Nutrition in 2004 covering 19 patients with severe carotid stenosis of 70 to 90%. Over a single year, the control group's carotid wall thickness grew 9%, while the pomegranate groups fell by as much as 30%, alongside a 21% drop in systolic pressure. By year 3, the benefit to lipid peroxidation held, but the thickness gains stopped. 19 patients at one center with a published core agendum is interesting rather than settled. All of that is the addition side, and the subtraction side counts at least as much. A 2024 dose-response meta-analysis in eClinical Medicine, pooling 20 studies and more than 1 million people, found one extra daily serving of ultra-processed food tracking with a 2.2% rise in cardiovascular event risk. 22 prospective studies pooled separately put the highest intake category at 17% higher cardiovascular disease risk, 23% higher coronary heart disease risk, and 9% higher stroke risk against the lowest. A 2024 BMJ umbrella review spanning 45 meta-analyses and nearly 10 million people found its strongest evidence in the link between ultra-processed food and cardiovascular death. Two arguments in this field deserve airing rather than burying. Saturated fat is the first. The PUR study reported that higher saturated fat consumption was neither detrimental to cardiovascular risk nor tied to higher all-cause mortality, and several systematic reviews of cohort data found no significant association between saturated fat and coronary artery disease. A JAC state-of-the-art review in 2020 sharpened the complaint, noting that the advice to limit saturated fat rests mainly on observational work rather than randomized prevention trials. Pushing the other way, research presented at the European Society of Cardiology Congress in 2024 found a high saturated fat diet damaging the heart more than a high unsaturated fat diet even without weight gain, with participants showing 20% more liver fat and 10% higher blood cholesterol after 24 days. The American Heart Association still says to use liquid plant oils in place of tropical oils and partially hydrogenated fats. Diet versus drugs is the second. Statin trials show them stabilizing and reversing plaque, shrinking non-calcified volume while shifting composition away from lipid and toward fibrous tissue. Those same reviews state bluntly that most dietary arms in statin-treated patients watched plaque volume progress anyway, and that diet alone has limited usefulness for regression once coronary disease is established. DISCO-CT resolves the tension. 92 patients were randomized to optimal medical therapy plus dietitian support on the DASH model, or that therapy alone and the diet-added group showed greater reductions in non-calcified plaque volume on CT. These are not competitors in the data. Stacking them wins. One more claim needs dismantling before the close. EDTA chelation therapy holds no FDA approval for treating coronary heart disease, yet it keeps getting sold as an artery cleanse, on the theory that stripping calcium from the bloodstream prevents atherosclerosis. The NIH's Complementary Health Center answers that atherosclerosis is far more complicated than excess calcium, and that dropping blood calcium can trigger fatal arrhythmias. The TAC trial did find an 18% reduction in its primary composite endpoint, but it stood alone and needed replication, and TAC-T2 failed to confirm any efficacy in patients with diabetes. The FDA has warned consumers away from every over-the-counter chelation and detoxification product because none of them are approved, which returns to where this started, and to an honest accounting of what these 17 foods do. No diet scrubs an artery clean. Plaque volume falls by roughly 1% a year in the strictest trials, and Ornish's headline amounted to just over 2 percentage points of stenosis across 12 months. That sounds trivial until you remember what triggers a heart attack. Around 70% begin with a rupture. Most at sites narrowed less than 70%, and what food changes best is not the size of the plaque but its stability, the health of the lining wrapped around it, and the volume of oxidized LDL feeding in. The AHA's 2021 guidance describes the target as a pattern rather than a product. Plenty and a variety of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, protein mostly from plants with regular fish and seafood, and liquid plant oils replacing tropical and hydrogenated fats. That same statement names the obstacles out loud, including food insecurity and the targeted marketing of unhealthy foods, because knowing what to eat and being able to eat it are two different problems. Coronary heart disease accounted for 39.5% of the 941,652 cardiovascular deaths recorded in the United States in 2022. Every food named here has been measured moving one of the numbers that leads there.